Hello, everyone, and welcome to Season 4, Episode 8 of Energy versus Climate. My name is Ed Whittingham, and I'm joined by my co-hosts David Keith and Sarah Hastings-Simon. Well, today is Canadian Federal Budget Day, and as we speak, I have friends and colleagues in budget lockup with their phones seized and likely in a hermetically sealed room, hopefully with enough air to last until 4 p.m. Eastern today, when the federal government is going to formally table Budget 2023 in the House of Commons. And it's, for us climate and energy policy wonks, kind of like Christmas comes early. We today expect more details on how the government is going to match the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act and its generous policy supports for clean energy to the degree that it can. And many people, myself included, have been sounding the FOMO alarm around IRA, worried that IRA has the potential to hoover up the global decarbonization dollars and those dollars looking for a safe and stable environment. And this could come at Canada's expense. So we'll see how the feds match today, but we already know that the federal government has committed to something called a contract for difference policy to bridge the competitiveness gap. But what the heck is a contract for difference, also known as a CfD as shorthand, and how can it help industrial decarbonization? What problems are CfDs designed to address? Where have they been used and were they successful? And ultimately, the key question is, will a contract for difference policy help to keep Canada competitive with the US in what has become a no-holds-barred clean energy transition race? So, to help us answer all these wonderfully wonky questions today, we are joined by Dr. Chris Bataille. Chris is Adjunct Research Fellow at Columbia University Center for Global Energy Policy and an Adjunct Professor at Simon Fraser University, as well as a researcher with the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations in Paris. He's been an IPCC lead author. He was managing partner at Navius Research and executive director of MK Jackard and Associates. And he's also one of Canada's premier energy systems and economic modelers who consults internationally. And two more very important points germane to energy versus climate. One, Chris grew up in Canmore, where David and I live. And two, he recently co-authored a report with Seton Stiebert about contract for difference policy called Leveraging Contracts for Difference for Heavy Industry Deep Decarbonization. And full disclosure, I've been leading a coalition of environmental NGOs and industry associations that have been advocating for a CfD policy, and two members of that coalition commissioned the report. But nonetheless, welcome, Chris. We're very happy to have you on the show.
It's a pleasure, Ed, and I blush at that introduction. Thank you.
Well, our format for the show is Chris and I will do a sort of quick and dirty CfD policy primer, after which then I will guide all four of us through some questions until 40 to 45 minutes past the hour, wherever you are, and then we'll get to that Q&A. So feel free to send in your questions via the Q&A box throughout the webinar. Remember, don't use the raise hand function or the chat box. So let's dive in, Chris, with the primer. CBC Radio has already been reporting this morning that Budget 2023 will ensure that any future government that backslides on climate policy will be forced to compensate companies for losses to their clean energy investments. That sounds like an allusion to a contract for difference policy, but what do you think, and what is a contract for difference policy anyway?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So we should probably just roll back a bit and just introduce what a contract for difference is. And it quite simply, it's an instrument that comes out of the financial market. It's a derivative. And all it is a contract between one party and another that if some index or price of something goes up or down and within certain bounds or certain values, there's agreement to pay or collect on the part of the other party. They came in, they're quite, that's basically options theory, right? And it applies, bank stocks go up or down and people trade on that and what have you. But it came into energy starting, I believe, in the European market and specifically in the UK market, where they were looking for a way to guarantee prices for renewables coming onto their electricity system in an efficient way. And what they did is set up what are called these reverse auctions, where companies would bid in to provide wind or solar, and the lowest price would win. And what they would bid in is the guaranteed minimum they needed to actually build the facility. So if they needed 15 cents per kilowatt hour, or 20 cents per kilowatt hour, whatever the equivalent was, if the electricity price was lower than that, the government would cover them for the under. So they made sure they were whole. But if the electricity price was higher, the government would keep the difference, right? So the company remained whole, but the government was kind of balancing itself on either end. And what it did is it reduced the risk for these companies to build these early facilities. And that mechanism has been so successful, it's been duplicated in all sorts of markets worldwide.
And Chris, so for our Alberta viewers and listeners, to me, that sounds a lot like the renewable electricity procurement program that the Alberta NDP ran from 2015 to about 2018. Was that, in effect, a CfD policy?
In effect, yes. Sarah is the deeper expert on the actual Alberta policy, but yes, effectively.
Great. So in this case, well, maybe before we get to what they could be applied to, are there other examples internationally where they've been used? So we've got the Alberta example. I've heard that there's a Netherlands example, but this isn't the Canadian government coming up with something new. But there's a track record of their use, and has it been successful?
Yeah, no, it's been very successful, and it's many, many, many different jurisdictions that started using these things just because they've been so efficient at drawing wind and solar into the market. And the government can control how much comes in, at what price. They know what the price, and what it does too is it reveals the prices in the market. So because the companies have to bid in, they're telling the world what their real production cost, right? So there's this sort of exploratory, this is what it's costing us for wind and solar today. This is what it's costing for us. We think it'll be in 2025 or 2030 or what have you. Because of the success of these programs, early in the European discussion, I was part of this through IDRI in Paris. There's a fellow by the name of Oliver Sartor that, I kind of looked at this along with climate strategists and other folks. Could you take this same model and apply it to things like reduced iron, to clinker, to the most intensive and homogeneous points in the industrial supply chain, and identify those points? And could you get companies to bid in to provide clean versions of that? So there were many different proposals. Several European governments have now proposed that they're looking at it. But the interesting thing is, these are typically on a given product, right? And they typically are indexed to the European ETS. Now, the thing there, with all derivatives, you need an index. You need something you're measuring against. As this thing goes up and down, this is what you collect or pay. So because they have that broad carbon pricing system there, and they're gradually pulling out all the exemptions, they have a clean index to run against. There have also been examples where it's on the product itself. Like if you haven't got a clean index to work with, you can put it on the tons of clinker, on the tons of cement, on the tons of iron, ethanol, methanol, or what have you.
So with CBC Radio's report today, they specifically mentioned that if a government backslides on climate policy, and they had Minister Champagne, saying nasty things about a potential future Pierre Poilievre government. And I heard Pierre Poilievre speak in Ottawa just last Thursday. He had two lines in a speech that got loud rounds of applause. One is he is going to turn the CBC building in Ottawa into affordable housing. The other, I was at a conservative conference, by the way, speaking there. The other was he's going to axe the carbon tax. And so in this case, when Minister Champagne, Jean-François Champagne, I think, when he says, if they're going to backslide, we're going to protect companies, is this tying a CfD policy to the carbon pricing system, or is it tying it to some other policy instrument? What specifically is he referencing?
Really, only the Department of Finance and Chrystia Freeland know right now.
Maybe we'll know at 4 p.m.
Yeah, we'll find out later today. Many different things are possible. This could be, as the Climate Institute, and I believe Blake at the School of Public Policy there proposed, this could be a carbon contracts for difference where it's indexed to some carbon price. So a company can buy in and say, if the carbon price is not X, if it's been wiped out, the government's on the hook for the whole difference, which could get very, very expensive, especially lots of companies buy into this. But there are real questions about this, right? Is it on the top line marginal price? Is it on because we have two different carbon pricing, well, we have many, many different carbon pricing systems in Canada. We've got
two is an understatement.
Yeah, exactly. So BC and Quebec is part of WCI with California. BC has its own pricing system. The Alberta is under tier for its heavy emitters, and I believe still under the federal system for the natural gas and diesel and gasoline and what have you. But the overarching federal backs the architecture or template is that for large emitters, you pay on a portion of your emissions, and it's the higher price. But once that portion is met, it drops to zero, right? So there's an average of all your emissions. For basically, that's for all the traded stuff. For the non-traded stuff, you pay on all of it. So when he says he wants to axe the carbon price, is he talking about the domestic carbon price? Is he talking about the OBP, the federal BPS? Is he talking if he becomes prime minister, he has power over the federal elements, not over the provincial elements. So there's a lot that could mean.
Gotcha. So in our conversation, we can differentiate between, say, the carbon price and the carbon price schedule, but also carbon value. The schedule is what the federal government has set, and it's going through to $170 a ton by 2030. But then carbon value is given the OBPS, the federal system, or provincial carbon pricing schemes that are equivalent or have been recognized as equivalent by the federal government, the actual value of carbon that it's trading at that time, which could be above the price schedule or it could be well below the price schedule.
Yeah, and that will be an outcome of the internal markets in each province, right?
Gotcha.
And it typically trades, and if it is a permit, it typically trades at a discount to the headline value.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Sarah and David. So that, EBC viewer, listener, we're getting pretty wonkish here, but this is a very important instrument that is really germane to budget 2023. So we'll get more details later today. Let's step back a level.
Yes.
And let's try to figure out the problem that we're trying to solve for in Canada. And where we know since 2015 and the Trudeau government coming in, they've built for themselves or made a pretty high teetering pancake stack of regulatory policy sticks and carrots. We've got the output-based pricing system, the industrial carbon pricing system. We've got the clean fuel regulations. We've got methane regs, the oil and gas emissions cap. We've got now, it's not finished, but an investment tax credit for CCUS, tax credits for renewables, clean electricity regulation, all these things. And yet the prevailing sense seems to be that the real industrial decarbonization capital isn't flowing, whether in cement or steel or fertilizer or nitrogen or oil and gas, that companies still aren't making those big $500 million to $1 billion investments to decarbonize their industrial processes. A, open it up to all of us. Is that true? And B, if it is true, then what is the problem? Why isn't that capital flowing?
Do you want me to answer that first before the other questions come up? Or
Sure. We'll let the guests go first, and then David, Sarah, feel free to jump in.
I think we need to be careful to distinguish between what's going on in the oil and gas industry and the rest of Canada. Sorry, not the rest of Canada, the rest of the economy.
Spoken like a true ex-Albertan there, Chris.
Yes. What is our overall goal as a society? We're a party to the Paris Agreement, which requires us to get to net zero by net zero CO2 by early 2050s, net zero GHGs by the 2070. the current government has committed to net zero GHGs by 2050, which is actually a fairly tight and stringent target. It's not what the Paris Agreement requires, but it is incumbent on more developed countries to have more ambition. If you have to look at our entire economy, what's going on, we have fairly strong vehicle regulations coming into place. They're nearly matched to California. Our building regulations are kind of, moving at various speeds, but we have some of the most efficient stock in the world. The question is, how do we pull out the natural gas heating and put it in something else, or just use absolute minimum natural gas in a highly efficient shell? The steel industry is largely committed to decarbonize, and along with federal investment, they're moving over to electric arc furnace steel making, along with some primary direct production. The cement industry is it's one of the most difficult and expensive industry. We know how to do it from an engineering perspective, but it's one of the most expensive on a per ton or per value product basis. And they've put, they're very advanced in their planning, but because it effectively may come close to doubling the cost of making clinker, they want help, right? Now, I think a lot is moving in Canada, and there's a lot of discussion. A lot of things are possible. I focus mainly on steel and cement because that's the stuff we're going to need post 2050. Like, to a certain extent, the whole oil and gas question will gradually evaporate as we transition the end use stock to electricity and hydrogen. But we're going to have, there's still, steel, cement. We're going to need chemicals. We're going to need aviation fuels. We're going to need all sorts of things. Like, there's a lot of work to be done there. So I'm not convinced that money is not flowing. I think there's a real debate over, I think there's a debate to be had whether we measure our success on whether blue hydrogen is being made in the Alberta oil patch as opposed to other things. Like, first of all, in the oil patch, this minus 75, our government committing to minus 75% fugitives by 2030 is very, very significant. It can be done cheaply. It can be done with existing technologies. And I think it's probably the most important thing that we get about doing today, because the oil and gas industry is going to run for a while, right? Then the question is are billions flowing into blue hydrogen the best place for Canada's limited billions to go? And that's a whole other discussion you can have. And I'll stop and give the other folks airtime.
Sure. Yeah, maybe turning to you, Sarah, like, what's the problem? Like, this is what I heard when I talked to federal bureaucrats about a CfD policy. They'd say, well, we want to take a step back and understand the problem that we're trying to solve for, if there's a problem. Do you think there's a problem?
I think there is a very specific problem that the CfD solves for, which is, we've built, as you said, over quite a number of years, going on 5 years plus now, this climate policy, this climate approach in Canada. And there is a weakness in it around certainty of carbon pricing. And I mean, to put a fine point on it, basically because not all political parties in Canada are, committing to continuing real climate policy and continuing carbon pricing, there is a, reasonable amount of risk that that carbon price could go away. And that weakens, it's almost like we've built this building of climate policy and we have, kind of a brick missing in the foundation, or we have a loose brick, or a brick that might break. I don't know, stretching the analogy here, but and the CfD is really about I see it as not layering more onto the top of this thing that we've built, but saying, we've built this, we've made a choice of how our building looks, and now we're going to go and fix this piece of the foundation to ensure that it's secure moving forwards. Rather than trying to say, oh, well, now look what the US has done, and now I want to tear down my building and build that, or, add something onto the side. And so that's, to me, the appeal. And the reason that I think the CfD approach does make a lot of sense is that, we also don't, to Chris's point, we don't have a lot of time, to rewrite climate policy. We don't have, the same industrial policy sort of machinery and mammoth that the US has. And so we have to kind of do things the Canadian way. And this is helping us to kind of shore up what we have. I think it's interesting when people or when companies or people looking for, funding in Canada say, well, it's so hard to get money here because all that money is going to that safe, stable US government. And I don't know who, reads the news about what's going on with the US government and where that government may, go in the next election and so forth. But I think there is a little bit, maybe too much of a rhetoric of, everything is perfect down there and it's all a mess up here in Canada. And so we have to fix it all. I think the reality is much closer to, it's not perfect and it's missing pieces, but we have a reasonably, sound approach, at least, to climate policy. And we have this political risk because there is a risk that a new government could come in and, change the carbon pricing approach. And a CfD goes a long way towards fixing that, with, of course, exactly how the devil's in the details as usual in terms of the design of it. But to me, that's the case for and the reason that I think CfDs can work.
Yeah, the irony, and sorry, David, I'll get to you in just a second. The irony on support in the U.S. is it looks like the Inflation Reduction Act has achieved bipartisan support. So this premier industrial strategy, decarbonization, clean energy deployment act works just as well in red states as it does blue states. And you look back to the Trump administration, and Trump actually strengthened 45Q rates as a Republican president who, as far as we can tell, is very skeptical about the science of climate change. And as I heard on Thursday, we still have the leader of His Majesty's official opposition, as he introduced himself apparently to President Biden in the House on Friday, that he is threatening to take away a key peg of that Canadian system of carbon pricing. Now, is it just essentially a fuel tax? Is it industrial carbon pricing? We don't know, but he still, in every stump speech, says, axe the tax. And I know that makes companies very nervous. And then they point to the US and say, no, we've got a 12-year runway with all the IRA supports. But, okay, David.
12 years is 12 years. Just one last thing on that. I mean, Alberta did now, in the tier update, confirm an increasing price schedule, right? So there is also, I know that can change if the federal government changes, but there is a certain amount of, the more that people believe that carbon pricing is here to stay and more companies make decisions on it, the harder it is even for a conservative government to walk that back to. But I'll turn it over to David.
Sure. Yeah, I'll try a nerdy and then I think less nerdy way to say it. I mean, governments are uncertain about future carbon prices for good reasons. I mean, external circumstance change, technology change, whatever. And I think the key point is the cost of cutting emissions is higher in a world with uncertain prices than a world with certainty equivalent prices. So if the carbon price was a coin flip between being, say, $50 a ton and $150 a ton, the point is if my government policy was that I'm going to flip a coin in 3 years and have 50 or 150, 50-50 odds, and you could figure out how much emissions cuts you get in that world and compare it to a world where you were sure the price would be 100, which is the average of the 50 and 150, you'd get more emissions cuts in a world where you're sure it was 100 than in the coin flip world. And I think the trick of contract for differences, or there are similar things, is for governments to try and provide a little contractual certainty into the future. Of course, there's no way to really bind the hands of the future, but provide some contractual certainty in the future against the carbon price uncertainty. The way to say it is essentially that the government will own the correlated uncertainty of its own decisions and the financial consequences from them, rather than pushing all the cost of the uncertainty in its decisions about climate policy onto the market.
So, a question to Chris, because we can come up with an instrument, and I want to get to the point of trying to tie the hands of a future government and just challenge the premise of that. Is that fundamentally undemocratic, and can you do it? Because we have examples where Doug Ford has shown us you're unable to do it. but Chris, so a contract for difference, let's say it's a carbon contract for difference policy, and it assures that price, and at that level, let's take the mid-range of what David said, the $100 a ton. But what if that still isn't enough on its own to get some of that deep decarbonization projects happening? You had mentioned cement being expensive. I know steel's expensive as well. You do a lot of work on net zero in the steel industry. So what's a government to do if even an aggressive carbon pricing schedule, and you can guarantee not just the price, but let's say you can guarantee the carbon value. What's the government to do if that still isn't enough?
Well, this is the interesting thing, right? Like there's a deeper question underlying a lot of this. Econ 101 or environmental econ, are you more interested in assuring price, right? Are you trying to equate marginal damages and costs, right? So you're trying to limit price, but that implies what the marginal damage schedule or what the costs of society is paying for the ongoing emissions, right? Or are you trying to assure quantity, right? So the thing is, what's happened with the Paris Agreement is that we've implicitly slid over to the need to assure quantity over assuring price, because the problem is CO2 it's because from where we understood it in the 90s as something that we could get away with, a 40% reduction, 50, 60, 70% reduction. No, we have to go to net zero, right? And because of the longevity of industrial facilities, if we're going to stay in the 1.5 to 2C bracket, by the early 2030s, all new facilities globally, right, or have to be near zero emitting, or you pay for very expensive for carbon dioxide removal. And this gets into the whole field that David literally pioneered to a certain extent, right? That is the fundamental conundrum we're facing globally and facing as a society.
Just to be clear, I have to say this every time. Net zero is only magic if you happen to be happy with the carbon dioxide and climate you have at that level. But if you want to have a world that has less climate risk, that's cooler in the future than at any given time, then you need to either remove carbon, that is go below net zero, or do solar geoengineering. If you're happy with the climate change you got, then net zero is for you.
Yes. Good.
Or if you believe there's really a threshold at 1.5, but there isn't.
No. I'm not. We have a political window of 1.5 to 2. Now, there's a whole other show you guys could have on what's happened with estimates of loss and damage and what, things like that. That's not what we're here to do here today. Now, in order to get a cement, the problem is with a cement or a steel or a chemicals plant, almost guaranteed those first plants are going to be far north of $170 per ton. And you put in a risk adjustment on the capital, you're getting really far north. Now, what happens when you get that first plant built, the first steel plant built or the first cement plant built, what you're doing is you keep knocking out huge amounts of risk from the perception of the company that did it, the broader steel industry, and the financiers that provide the money, right? So a lot of my work focuses on how do we get those first steel, cement, and chemicals plants built so that we see at least one that's near zero, what's working, not working, that allows us to build the second, the third, what have you, which gets you down on that learning curve where it becomes engineering and not fear more than anything else. So just to give you an example, up until about 2017, the mantra was that we would need CCS for steel. That was just the only way to do it, right? There was the VP of tech at SSAB in Sweden pulled his PhD thesis off the shelf, which was on a direct reduction of iron with an electric arc furnace, and doing it with all hydrogen instead of a carbon monoxide and hydrogen syngas, and said, what about this? And it wasn't him that started. It was actually one of the steelmaking communities that went to SSAB and said, how are we going to guarantee our living moving forward here, given there's no CCS geology, what have you? That started a conversation with the electricity company, with the mining company, with the Swedish government, which led to the first large near zero pilot and led to the building of the first commercial scale facility. The building of the hybrid project has triggered a whole swath of different planned projects across Europe and even globally now. They're not all HDRI, EAF, there's a whole bunch. And it triggered a flow of money into things into the various electrolysis technologies, be it hot electrolysis, aqueous electrolysis, or what have you. So there was a mental shift in the industry that happened because someone showed that it was largely possible. There is a huge value in these early plants getting built. And coming back to our CfDs, if you can put a production tax credit on those first tons of clinker, those first tons of green iron, those first tons of methanol, ethanol, propylene, the BTX chemicals, what you're doing is you're bringing the industry down out of the unbreathable atmosphere. Like if you're an alpinist, you're getting them down into the breathable zone where they can think rationally about the risks and then start thinking more about the engineering and the finance.
Yeah. And maybe just a quick question. So I understand, Chris, the relationship between risk and why you would need a higher carbon price or assurance on a higher carbon price. We had Sally Benson of Stanford on the show last season talking about carbon capture, and she talked about the 40 projects that have already been deployed around the world. Like with carbon capture particularly, is there still a technology risk, or have we largely de-risked it through existing projects?
Until you've built a megaton facility that runs reliably, that doesn't break, yes, there's risk. The problem is CCS is something we've been able to do since the 1990s. If you have a concentrated flow of CO2 coming out of out of an industrial facility, right? It's the basis of an enhanced oil recovery. There are several industrial processes where you can literally grab the CO2, like formation gas cleaning, ethanol making, what have you. You can take the CO2 and compress it, put it underground, use it for enhanced oil recovery, or put it down into deep saline aquifers. There's zero technology risk there. Where the risk is the post-combustion capture. And the dirtier the flue gas and the more variable the flue gas, the more risk there is.
Got you. What I'd like to do. Oh, go ahead, Sarah.
Maybe just to jump in on that. I mean, I think that's a perfect example of, good policy design identifies the risk or the barrier that you're trying to overcome and then uses a tool that's well adapted to address that, right? So I think that CfDs and carbon pricing in general, and then guaranteeing that is, very good when you're talking about projects that don't necessarily have a lot of technology risk. They may have a cost that's more, reflecting the cost of the externality. But the risk that you're trying to solve for there is really the risk of government changing the policy. If you're talking about a technology risk where, you think, okay, you're going to build this thing and you don't know if it's going to operate the way that you want it to because it's the first of its kind, that's a different kind of risk. It's a technology risk. And again, though, I think there's approaches that are better than subsidies for governments to address those risks, because basically, if you just go with subsidies when you're trying to address technology risk, then the problem is, either the project doesn't work, okay, fine, then maybe the subsidy was enough to cover it, but it has to be a pretty big subsidy in that case. And if it does work, then that just becomes a windfall profit to, the company who now has this operating facility and a huge amount of government cash. And so that's where, again, it's sort of, I understand the attractiveness of that approach in some ways, but I don't think it's the best government policy if you're trying to address technology risk.
Sure. Maybe you just need a financing instrument or institution that is willing to take, a public institution that's willing to take technology risk. I'd say like the Department of Energy's loans program in the US compared to what we've had. Now, we had a recent announcement, but the Canada Infrastructure Bank hasn't been as willing to take technology risk as the loans program. But what I'd like to do, so there are arguments against CfD policy, contracts for difference, and I'd like to kind of walk through them, and maybe the three of you could either don your Francois Philippe Champagne hat. By the way, sorry, Francois Philippe, I got your name wrong last time, as minister when you're supporting it, or you could put on your Pierre Poilievre hat, who probably doesn't want his government bound by future contracts, and just tell me what you think of these counter arguments. And the first one, we alluded to it, is it undemocratic to try to tie the hands of a future government? Because, and I'm just going to pull a number that's really out of thin air, but it's been bandied about by folks in the know in Ottawa. Let's say the government of Canada today in 2023 hypothetically enters into CfDs that then creates a $200 billion liability for the 2030 government of Canada. Is that something that is just by its nature fundamentally undemocratic?
No, that's easy. I mean, democracies do stuff like that all the time, and the hands aren't bind because you can always break the contracts. Governments have very broad powers in case of war or big disruption. I mean, if you're really saying it's undemocratic to bind the hands at all, then I guess we're not even allowed to have constitutions or a British North America Act. I think that's a silly argument.
Okay.
I think the issue is it good policy or not?
Sure. Yeah, I'm with David there. And I mean, this is sort of related to a question I think that Jeffrey Levitt posed. I think just because we think that can be a good policy mechanism, it doesn't really mean whether you think the policy itself is good or not. I think that depends on, how it's applied and how it's used. I think the other point that I would just add to sort of pile on David's point is that governments bind the hands of future governments in all kinds of ways that are maybe sometimes less transparent, right? And that's the whole concept of like path dependency. What's different in a contract for difference is you're sort of putting that in a, financial contract. And so the constraint becomes very clear. But, previous decisions about where and how to develop our transportation sector and roads and trains and all these kinds of things create arguably more, than $200 billion worth of infrastructure that has been built that binds future hands. So I think it's just, there's all kinds of ways that we kind of like to sometimes pretend is not the case, actually, that decisions bind, future governments or future societies. And that comes up here.
Yeah, okay, that makes a lot of sense. And maybe, Chris, so if we think that it's fine, it's commonplace to tie the hands of future governments, there's still, though, within Finance Canada and any kind of bean counter within a government, there are two words that have them screaming for the exits, and those two words together are uncapped liabilities. And so an argument is, gee, well, it's going to be hard to do this mechanism if you do come one, come all, contracts for difference for everyone in an Oprah-like way, then it's going to create this huge future liability. If you do it through some sort of competitive process, then you run the risk of, the process being corrupted, or you're picking winners and losers. Like, from your past review of other programs, like how do you do it in a way that is fair and transparent, and ultimately for the taxpayer who is going to be on the hook in case the carbon value, the production value is out of sync? Like, how do you do it in a way that protects the taxpayer and picks the best projects?
Well, no, there's a lot in your question there. The first, coming back to the option that was put on the table by Climate Choices, is that you set the contract value at sub 170 or 150. So you're collecting a little bit of an insurance policy for the government in case there is a complete failure. So there are different ways that you can hedge this, and the government has all sorts of lawyers and what have you. I really do hope the government finance has looked at this very carefully for the holes. The second thing, though, is I think we need to this is coming back to our whole quantity and price certainty thing, is what are we trying to achieve here with this, right? Like, should we be expending all our political capital and billions on assuring this 170 pathway and what have you? It happens, and there's an argument for that. Or not, but I think we do need to think in the context of what is our net zero plan, where do we have competitive advantages, what industries are likely to grow and what industries are likely to shrink, and have it as a very fulsome conversation with the provinces, with the cities, and what have you, and have some level of national prioritization being set by, this is how Canadians are going to be employed in 2100 or 2070 or what have you. We don't have an unlimited funds to work with. We're not the Americans with their huge economies of scale in terms of being able to subsidize everything and this monstrous loan fund at DOE and what have you. We do need to think about our priorities and where we're going to focus. So I do think there's a little bit of a balancing that, and I do get a little no one expected Doug Ford's government just to tear up WCI and all the Ford contracts and the billions in liabilities that they've just shrugged off, that the holders of those contracts are now going after our Canadian federal government for liability. And that's going to be in the courts probably throughout this decade, right? This is on a whole other scale. So I completely agree with Sarah and David. Governments bind each other all the time, but sometimes governments do dumb things, right? Or maybe don't understand what they're doing, what liabilities they might be creating, and then deal with the chaos afterwards.
Yeah, my statement wasn't an endorsement that contract for differences are just fine. I think the point is, I think you could imagine a much simpler scheme. I think the problem is the unbounded nature of setting up a contract for difference scheme, a window where many companies can apply. Yeah. So, if I was czar, which I'm obviously not going to be, and it was simple, I might sort of do two fundamental things. One is something that looks a lot like an even carbon price. And then I'd say there's a real social benefit to trying to start technologies that we know we're going to eventually use for decarbonization, but are not economic under that carbon price, as you just said, Chris, like cement plants or whatever. But for those, the simple thing is not adding on to the stack of pancakes, as Ed calls it, still what is fundamentally another complicated pancake. Just keep it simple. Just have a direct contract to actually, have a contract. We want to build 2 cement plants with this range of technologies, bid on them, and the government just buys them and keeps it small and simple. And that makes it very, very simple. It is binding the future for that contract, but it's only one contract. You're not opening up a window that's general. You're not making a big complicated policy. You're just procuring something.
Great. We got lots of questions. Let's get into questions early. So I've got one here from Doug Page. How does the government not pay for a majority of credits with CCFDs, as a few CCUS projects will ultimately flood the market and depress prices? Without liquidity in the market, it seems like companies will opt to buy credits much more than ultimately reduce emissions. It feels more political than creating market functions for companies to compete within. So it gets to this notion, and maybe, we differentiate between price certainty and carbon value certainty. Sure, you're sitting here, we're in Alberta. Chris, you're from Alberta. We've got a tier system, Alberta's industrial carbon pricing system, that is closed. You have a big CCUS project or two go ahead. They're going to take all those credits that they generate under tier, put them on the market, and then immediately you could just completely depress the carbon value price, the prevailing carbon value price in Alberta, making any future projects that come along that want to do the same thing completely uneconomic. So how do we not do that?
Two ways to do it. One, radically bring down the benchmarks so that the tier benchmarks, or if you take a contract for difference, you can't sell the excess credits into the market. But you can't get both subsidies. You get one or the other. Yeah. Or, yeah. And I think that's actually an essential point. If we're doing these CFDs or whatever kind, you can't flood the market, right? You just can't sell them. The second is, and I think this is actually a broader question, when we set up the OBPS and the tier, we didn't right away set in a ratcheting mechanism to make them deeper and deeper and deeper, right? It became something we negotiated instead of something mathematical that becomes eventually net zero compliant. That was, it was a political necessity at the time, but it was a big problem. It is a big problem. We can't keep fighting over that. Like we need a re-benchmarking schedule that is net zero compliant.
Yeah. So that's a good point, Chris. And to be clear, we're not talking about a two for one credit value windfall.
No.
That you're compensated through your CFD and you monetize those credits. It's one, not the other. And actually, in that case, the big CCS project we have operating in the province is Shell Quest, the Scotford upgrader project. That got a 2-for-1 credit scheme. That's what got it off over FID. So if you're thinking that, I guess we can retire that concern. Okay, I got a second question here.
Just one thing I actually wanted to add to that, though, because I think it gets at another point around kind of CFDs and around policy certainty, which is that as long as we're still, going to live in a capitalist society and we're going to use markets to reduce emissions in this way, I don't think that CFDs are about, providing a 100% guarantee that this for sure will be the price in the market. It's about filling in a pretty big policy uncertainty that a government comes in and completely scraps the whole thing, right? But I think there is still going to be some level of, market variability. There's going to be some, as the market, as you have maybe you incent, a lot more projects and those come online and you do end up with more credits in the market. And then you need to have that ratcheting. So you have some market rebalancing and others. And that it really is the job of, the companies and the bankers and others that are hoping to make money off of this space to also be willing to take a bit of that risk in exchange for those profits too. So I think that's also important to kind of recognize and say, what we're trying to get to is the removal of this really fundamental, huge policy uncertainty of a complete 180 on carbon pricing versus, providing everybody guaranteed profits at low risk kind of thing.
And and maybe question back to Chris, like, how do we deal with the policy interaction? You've just addressed, okay, well, there's no double counting or rather double profiting on this, double selling. But then how do you match that with, say, credits that an oil and gas producer might get under the clean fuel regulation?
No, this is super important, right? With the pancake that you're describing here, I am more... there are lots of arguments either way, but I think better designed, more strategic contracts are better than a much broader set that are targeted at key social goals, because these poly interactions are very important, and they can turn into fairly massive subsidies to projects. So, like, just for my example, like we're doing another project down in California. Can we use the ZEV site, the whole ZEV structure that was put together by CARB for cement? Can you make ZEC credits, right? So we had to go in there and what's a projected cap and trade price? Like what's the credit price in there? What is the effect of the IRA? Then what is the final thing that you actually have? What's the final, extra cost of the ZEC credits that are going to be necessary for that market? These things are very important and add up. And if you don't add them up properly, you can end up with a gameable system and very large subsidies.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe it's an argument for going ahead with a few projects on like a bespoke basis to try to figure out how to do this. And I know, and probably going in, and as a taxpayer, eyes wide open, that we might not get the mechanism right to start, and it might err on the side of too much subsidy and might err on the side of not enough. And all we know is that we probably shouldn't send in the Finance Canada bureaucrats to do the negotiations. And just to be clear, what the feds have proposed is not running it under Finance Canada. It's running it under a new mechanism, the Clean Growth Fund, that would be under CDEV. But we could get it wrong, but I think it behooves us to try to figure it out with a few projects to start and then learn from that before you have any kind of come one, come all system. Let's get to another question. David Zekveld. Hi, great panel. Thank you, David. How do you envision CfDs working in an export market, i.e. green hydrogen, ammonia produced in Canada and sold in Europe? Do we expect that Canada would support CfD for an exported product?
So I think if I'll throw one thought in there that's sort of related to this, but more generally, right? I think that if the goal of the CfD is to provide policy security or policy certainty around carbon pricing, then it should reflect the design of carbon pricing, which is meant to be, sort of technology and sector neutral when it comes to the value of reducing emissions. So I think that would, as if you're doing something that lowers your emissions in Canada, that should be eligible to be covered under carbon pricing in the same way. It illustrates actually a problem when you're sort of paying people directly for emissions reductions. That is in an interesting paper that came out recently that looked at, the effect of 45Q in the power sector in the US and showed by Emily Grubert that showed that you can actually end up having higher emissions because you're essentially incenting emissions reduction. So you end up doing something that is, more highly emitting than the alternative, which would be, switching to wind and solar and retiring those coal plants. But the policy is only paying you for the CCS. And so that's sort of I think a good example of the problem of trying to target directly, say, carbon capture and storage in particular, where you're then not comparing it well to other pathways to provide the same output, in this case, electricity, that can have fundamentally lower emissions, through a process, not through a capture. So I think that this does need to be sort of neutral to what you're doing in terms of guaranteeing that carbon price applying.
Here.
Yep. To that point around green hydrogen, still, we'll see what comes out today, and including an investment tax credit. We'll get more details for electrolytic
what's green
hydrogen.
Hydrogen doesn't have a color.
Electrolytic hydrogen. I was just about to say, David.
So it's green, even if I do it in some way where I've dammed a beautiful river and I destroy things. Can we stop this bullshit? One thing that at least the Americans have done well is they don't use this stupid color scheme. They actually have carbon intensities, and you could have other environmental impacts. We've got to get out of this nonsense. Come on.
I agree. So I was just in the process of saying electrolytic hydrogen when you jumped in, but
it's less than 30 grams per kilowatt hour, or less than 10.
Exactly. Let's just move it to a carbon intensity basis. But we'll see what comes out today. The supports in IRA are so strong at up to $3 a kilogram, covering your cost of production. I'd be surprised if there's still an economic case for producing electrolytic hydrogen in Canada after today. I hope so, but what I hear is if that's what you want to produce, You're in Alberta, you'll step across the border into Montana and produce there and harvest that IRA credit all day, every day.
Maybe not. There's a very strong debate, unless this has been, I've been on vacation for 3 days, but unless someone solved this, but there's a very strong debate right now on whether you do monthly, annual matching, or if it's on an hour by hour basis matching, right? Those have very strong, like for the big three, the $3 a kilogram credit, how that debate plays itself out and ends up in the statutes and how the DOE or whoever's implementing this runs it could change things.
All right. Our favorite questioner, Robert Tremblay, he's got a question here. We often think of CCFDs being something that applies to technologies like CCS. I've heard others speculate that they could also apply to other projects that demonstrably reduce emissions like renewables, nuclear energy storage, transmission. We just talked about electrolytic hydrogen, for instance. Is this likely? How large should we expect the variety of projects using CCFDs to be? And then I'll add, is this my own thought? Is this just a policy targeted to get carbon capture projects and that 50 megatons by 2050, 2030 of carbon capture that the government is looking for? Or is it really likely to apply to other technology pathways? Or who knows? I guess. Who knows?
Guess we'll see in a few hours. I feel like I sort of gave my soapbox speech on, why it should not be technology specific, right? And the fact that if the goal at the end of the day is to have some output, whether that's electricity or hydrogen or moving your car, moving yourself, I should say, from point A to point B, we should try not to, have the carbon price as a policy be preferentially choosing one of those versus another, as opposed to, if we're going in and saying we think this is a technology we need to demonstrate, to David's point. But I think that the fundamental point of carbon pricing is really to have that neutrality across solution options.
Sure. I guess we should tackle Jeffrey Levitt's other argument. And full disclosure, Jeffrey Levitt, who is on today, thank you. We had an email discussion about a month ago, I think, when I'd mentioned CFD policy, I think in our offsets show last December. And Jeffrey, tip our hats to you. You weren't the only reason we're doing a show on it today, but you certainly got us thinking. But he says one argument against a CFD policy is they can be used for climate ill rather than just climate good. And I'm paraphrasing. I'm trying to scroll up to see your question again. But you mentioned how it's being used by the Ford government to keep natural gas-fired electricity generation whole or potentially whole if it becomes economic under the clean electricity regulation. And therefore, I'm sorry, we're sort of platforming you, but you're not speaking, then you're saying, well, that kind of delegitimizes CFD as a policy. So the fact, I don't know, I think this is a softball question, but Sarah, Chris, David, the fact that it could be used for ill instead of used for good, does that invalidate it, or can we do something to guard against it being used for ill?
I think we're kind of over complexifying this. I think to come back to where I think there's a fair amount of agreement is there's a reason for the government to find a way to take some of the price uncertainty on its back that it creates. That's an underlying reason. But I think that we do risk is understating it. We are building overly complex policy, and overly complex policy is more easily gamed by insiders. And I think a challenge of the current system is we have the stack of pancakes that we're not removing and we're adding another thing that has some advantages, but adds even more complexity to the process.
Yeah. And on that complexity, so it gets to the question Mike Hill has asked around rates of return. So, as a company, you're going to develop a CCS plant. It's not just bolt-on technology on the end of a kiln or a blast furnace. It's an entirely separate plant. It costs north of $1 billion. And you're not going to go ahead and do that unless you get some sort of return on invested capital and a risk premium factored into that. And I guess if you're a government designing what is a complex policy instrument, what is a fair return on investment capital? And how do you make a decision on that? You'd pick a nice round number and say 10%. Yeah, we'll keep you whole up to 10%.
But
I don't know.
this
What
is
do you
why
think?
this is why you have to get back to your strategic goals. What are you trying to achieve as a society? What is your net zero plan? What have you? And then you need to let the market work once you know what it is. Like I'm because I am very interested in green iron, clean electrons, green iron, green clinker, what have you. But the market will sort. This is why you employ things like you've got an innovation program to help the companies do the things that they can't do by themselves. The UK kind of tore apart the whole offshore floating wind supply chain, found the gaps the companies couldn't do, used government money to help work with the companies to fill them, then collapsed the supply chain and then went back into reverse auction method. You need to use these market mechanisms for price revelation. There's a better term for it. But that will tell you what does it actually cost to deliver green iron, green clinker, green electrons, what have you. Yeah.
And Chris, I mean, is this an instrument, just to be clear, are we talking about using it until such time that the market will bear that cost premium associated with decarbonizing steel production or decarbonizing cement production? So the moment, let's say it doubles, let's say it's 1.5x or it doubles the cost, the market price, and it's uneconomic right now, but at that time when people are willing to pay that cost premium by hook or by crook, then I assume the mechanism goes away.
That's the third thing. What is your policy trying to achieve? I forget my notes here. It's like, what are you trying to achieve? What are you with these contracts? What are you indexing to? And when do you shut the policy down? What is the end goal, right? You need to really have that clearly in mind. And then you shut your policy down and you move to more standard mechanisms. On the point earlier about investment rates of capital, that's up to the companies. They can choose to bring in their capital or not. They have internal rates of return that they have to use. What you're trying to do is entice them over the line that they make that final investment decision.
Gotcha. Okay, Aaron Crosby, or Aaron Cosby, sorry, Aaron, I think it's Aaron Crosby. Sorry, Aaron, if you're the same Aaron that I'm thinking of. Doesn't the uncapped liability issue simply provide incentives to design the carbon markets well, such that, for example, there's not a flood of cheap credits from over-generation offset provisions, or that, like the EU ETS, there is a market stability reserve? Is this fundamentally a failure of carbon market design? I guess it is.
I mean, I think ideally, in a sense, it's all these things come together in terms of I come back to the idea that the CFD, I think it's important. It's not a silver bullet that you put that in place and then you walk away and it's completely fixed forever, right? You still have to ensure that you have a good market design, that there is, that you don't have a flood of credits that depresses the price in the market. And then fundamentally that you're essentially, I think if it's done well, you're also working towards a world where you have a sufficiently large constituency that, wants to see things continue as they are, that you almost at some point don't need the CfDs anymore, right? Because there's all kinds of government policies that we have in place that don't have contracts, and people just, assume that they will continue because there is a sufficiently large constituency that wants to see them continue. And I think you saw that a little bit, I would say that's behind why Alberta kept, the tier or, some form of industrial carbon pricing, even though they got rid of the, consumer side of it, but they kept the industrial one because you had a constituency of industrial players in the Alberta market who, have sort of adopted the system, have made plans around it and want to see that continue. And so the CFD in my mind is a little bit of a, stopgap if you want, or it has a certain interim nature in that as you're creating certainty in the market by just having that market be there and having people expect it to be there and having people make investment decisions about it being there, that it gets more entrenched as a policy and is harder to take away.
Great, thanks. And sorry, Aaron, yes, it is Cosby. I'm having a bad name day. Aaron of the International Institute for Sustainable Development and doing lots of work on border carbon adjustments. Okay, we're at time. Maybe last one, Chris, what do you expect to come out of the budget today on CFD policy?
That's an excellent question. I think you're going to see a pot of cash, but I think you're going to see that the rules still need to be defined, and they've left some wiggle room as opposed to CCFDs or PCFDs or what have you. But there will be a pot of cash of some sort and a commitment to use it. But I think that, and then the moment comes after this, and this is what happens in UNICEF, where you have to dive in and set the rules for how you do this. So I think there's still some conversations to be had.
Great. And we can expect multiple pots of cash coming out of today's budget. I don't think it's going to show a lot of fiscal restraint. Okay. Well, let's leave it at that. Chris, thank you very much. It was wonderful. Great to reconnect by Zoom. And we really appreciate you being on Energy versus Climate today.
My pleasure, all.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Take care.
A reminder that this episode will be available at energyversusclimate.com and on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen. Please rate and review us on your favorite podcast platform. That always helps new listeners to find the show. Send your feedback to info@energyversusclimate.com. We'll be back in April with another episode. We might react to something that's in the budget today. We're expecting quite a lot on electrification of Canada, not just decarbonizing electricity, but overall electrification as we electrify heat and mobility. So perhaps we'll do something on that. Make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform and at energyversusclimate.com to be notified when it's available. Thanks again to Chris Bataille. Thanks to Hannah Tai, Priya Kuni-Kulato, Crystal Hickey, and our always patient producer, Eva Voinigescu, for all your support. See you next time, everyone.